The fog hung thick over the Ardennes forest that morning. December 17, 1944. Belgium. Winter so cold it burned. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller sat in his foxhole, frozen fingers wrapped around a pencil, writing words that would haunt him until the day he died. The Americans are not like the Russians. Their artillery is something else entirely. He paused, breath clouding in the air. Around him the forest was quiet, too quiet. It is not the volume of fire, though that is terrible enough. It is the speed. It is the accuracy. It is the knowledge that you have no time to react. One moment, there is silence. The next moment, the world explodes. That morning, Müller had watched something impossible. His battalion, part of the 6th SS Panzer Army, had just launched Hitler's final gamble in the West. They'd achieved complete surprise, smashed through thinly held American positions. Victory had felt close enough to taste. And then the American artillery found them, what Müller didn't. No, what no German soldier advancing through those snow-covered trees could have known, was that they were about to face the most lethal artillery system ever, deployed in human history. A system so advanced, so devastatingly precise, and so perfectly coordinated that it would shatter the back of Germany's last offensive and reveal the true depth of American military superiority. The collapse had started long before the Bulge. Throughout 1943 and 1944, German veterans transferred from the Eastern Front to face Americans in Italy, France, and the Low Countries. They carried with them assumptions forged in desperate battles against Soviet guns. They had learned to survive Russian artillery the hard way. Through blood and luck, the Russians fired ranging shots. That gave you precious seconds to dive for cover. The shells arrived in predictable patterns. You could move between barrages if you were quick and lucky. Fire direction was slow, 10, maybe 15 minutes from observation to impact. You could survive that. Thousands had. But the Americans? The Americans were different. Terrifyingly different. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, 2 years on the Eastern Front, captured with the Afrika Korps in Tunisia, May 1943, would describe his first encounter with American artillery in a post-war interview that still sounds like a man trying to explain the impossible. We had taken position in a wadi, north of Tunis. Good cover, we thought. Natural depression. Stone walls. He lit a cigarette, hands shaking slightly even years later. The Russians would have needed an hour to find us, another hour to range their guns. We felt safe enough to heat morning coffee. A pause. The memory sharp as broken glass. Then we saw it. A small aircraft, no bigger than a reconnaissance plane, puttering overhead at maybe 500 meters. We barely paid attention. Such aircraft had no weapons. We assumed it was taking photographs. Schmidt's voice dropped. 3 minutes later, without warning, without ranging shots, without any indication whatsoever, the entire wadi erupted. Shells landing simultaneously. Not in sequence. Air bursts above us. Ground bursts among us. In 30 seconds, my company ceased to exist as a fighting unit. He stubbed out the cigarette. I was one of 11 survivors, from 123 men. The aircraft Schmidt had seen was an L-4 Grasshopper, an unassuming Piper Cub, fabric and plywood, the kind of plane that looked like it belonged at a county fair. Not a battlefield, but those little spotter planes would become the most feared aircraft in the German military, not for any weapons they carried, but for what followed their appearance. German soldiers learned a bitter truth, whispered from foxhole to foxhole, passed along in letters home that would never make it past the censors. When you see a grasshopper overhead, you have minutes, maybe only seconds, before American artillery turns your position into a killing ground. The sound of that little engine became the sound of death. Approaching, Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, Anno, artillery officer who'd coordinated counter-battery fire on the Eastern Front. For 2 years, documented his astonishment in letters discovered decades later in German military archives. I studied American artillery procedures from captured documents. Initially, I believed these documents were deception, propaganda designed to intimidate. His handwriting was precise, methodical, the handwriting of a man trained in mathematics and ballistics. No artillery system could perform as described. The coordination required would be impossible. The next entry was dated 3 days later. Then I witnessed it myself. Near Seine-Armand, an American grasshopper appeared. We tracked it, preparing to displace our guns as standard procedure. Before we could move, before we had even computed firing data for counter-battery fire, American shells were landing on our position. Not random fire, not area saturation, precise fire on each gun. The handwriting was less steady now. They had calculated firing solutions, coordinated multiple batteries at different ranges, and delivered simultaneous fire in less time than it took our own forward observers to radio map coordinates to our fire direction center. At the bottom of the page, underlined twice, "This should not be possible." The secret to American artillery superiority wasn't a single innovation. It was a comprehensive system that integrated technology, training, and industrial capacity at a level Germany could never match. The foundation was the Fire Direction Center, a concept that revolutionized artillery employment, where German artillery batteries calculated firing solutions individually, each gun crew working through the math, adjusting for wind and temperature and barrel wear. American batteries fed all data to a central fire direction center. One hub, coordinating dozens of batteries simultaneously. The FDC system depended on something that sounds simple, but represented years of painstaking work. Pre-computed firing tables. In offices across the United States, rooms full of women sat at desks with mechanical calculators, slide rules, and logarithm tables, computing, endlessly computing. Firing solutions for every conceivable combination of variables: wind speed and direction, temperature, humidity, barrel wear, propellant temperature, altitude differences between gun and target, every possible scenario, every angle, every range. They worked for years, thousands of hours on mechanical calculators that clicked and whirred and spat out numbers. The results were printed in books small enough to carry in a map case. In the field, American fire direction officers didn't have to calculate. They just looked up the answer. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, a mathematics professor conscripted into Wehrmacht artillery, examined captured American firing tables after the war. His analysis, preserved in German military records, reads like a man discovering that his entire professional life had been spent doing things the hard way. These tables represent years of computational work, thousands of hours on mechanical calculators. They had computed solutions for every variable we might encounter in the field. Temperature ranges from Arctic to desert, altitude from sea level to mountain operations, every combination of propellant charge and projectile weight. His tone shifts to something close to awe. Our own firing tables were crude by comparison. They required extensive field calculations for each mission. We had to adjust, compute, adjust again. The Americans had done the mathematics in advance. In the field, they simply looked up the answer. But firing tables alone couldn't explain the devastating effectiveness of American artillery. The true revolution was something called time on target, universally known as TOT of firing. Techniques so advanced that few nations in the world possessed the capability to execute it. Time on target coordinated artillery fire so that shells from multiple batteries fired at different times based on their distance from the target arrived simultaneously within a 3-second window. The effect was catastrophic. German soldiers experienced no warning, no ranging shots, no gradual buildup of fire. One instant, silence. The next instant, dozens of shells detonating simultaneously. Troops, caught in the open, whose survival against conventional artillery depended on dropping prone at the first explosion, had no time to react. Studies conducted after the war revealed that 66% of Artillery casualties occurred in the first few seconds of a barrage, time on target maximized. Casualties by eliminating warning. It turned artillery from a weapon you could survive, through luck and reflexes, into something that felt like the hand of God, crushing you from above. Stabsfeldwebel. Kurt Zimmermann survived TOT strikes during the Battle of the Bulge. His diary was discovered by American forces in a captured command post. The pages were water-stained, blood-stained in places. One entry, dated December 20th, 1944. It is not artillery as we understand it. It is something new. You hear nothing. Then the world ends. Every shell arrives in the same second. The air bursts kill men who would survive ground bursts. The ground bursts kill men who would survive air bursts. There is no time to dive for cover, no time to reach a hole, no time even to drop flat. You are simply alive one moment and wounded or dead the next. At the bottom of the page, in pencil so faint it's barely visible, God help us. The speed of American artillery response shocked German commanders. German artillery, considered among the world's best, could deliver fire in 8 to 10 minutes under ideal conditions. American artillery routinely delivered accurate fire in 3 minutes. 3 minutes from the moment a forward observer called for fire to the moment shells were screaming down range. This speed came from multiple factors. American forward observers used FM radios that provided clear, static-free communication. German forces still relied primarily on AM radios plagued by interference. Voices lost in crackle and hiss. Coordinates repeated 3 times and still garbled. American radios were also far more numerous. Every infantry battalion had multiple radio-equipped forward observers. German battalions typically had 1 or 2 radios, often shared between units. The forward observers themselves represented another American advantage. German forward observers were artillery officers, often lacking infantry training or experience. They understood guns and trajectories, but not the rhythm of infantry. Combat American forward observers were specially trained personnel who understood both artillery and infantry tactics. They moved with infantry units, lived with infantry soldiers, ate the same rations, slept in the same mud, faced the same dangers. They coordinated fire as an integrated part of combined arms operations. And here's the thing that German commanders couldn't wrap their heads around. Single American forward observer could call upon an entire corps' artillery, not just his own battalion, not just his division. Every gun within range. A lieutenant, a single officer, maybe 24 years old, probably from Iowa or Alabama or Pennsylvania, could coordinate fire from dozens of batteries within minutes. He could bring down the weight of metal equivalent to a small airstrike, delivered more accurately and more rapidly than any air support could provide. One man, one radio, and the firepower of a small army. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller commanded an infantry regiment destroyed near St. Lo in July 1944. His final report, written from a hospital bed, his right arm gone, below the elbow, documents this capability with the precision of a man who understands he witnessed something that changed warfare forever. A single American infantry company, surrounded in a village, held my entire regiment for 6 hours. Every time we attempted to assault, artillery fire drove us back, not from one battery, but from what seemed like dozens of batteries, that a forward observer with that company, probably a lieutenant or captain, commanded more firepower than I could bring to bear. With my entire regimental artillery, we lost 400 men attempting to overrun 120 Americans. The last line, we failed. The artillery pieces themselves demonstrated American industrial superiority. The M2A1 105 mm howitzer, the standard American light artillery piece, was a marvel of engineering and manufacturing. Rock Island Arsenal had perfected production, techniques that allowed rapid manufacturing to precise tolerances, assembly line efficiency applied to weapons of war. By the end of World War II, 8,536 M2A1 howitzers had been produced. Each American infantry division had 36 of these howitzers, organized into 3 battalions of 12 guns each, fully motorized, towed by trucks or half-tracks that could move at highway speeds, displacement from one firing position to another, an evolution that took German horse-drawn artillery 2 to 3 hours, took American motorized batteries 20 to 30 minutes. The contrast in mobility was stark. German artillery remained predominantly horse-drawn throughout the war, despite Nazi propaganda showing mechanized panzer divisions rolling across Europe in a tide of steel and smoke. The reality was different. Approximately 80% of Wehrmacht motive power relied on horses. Horses for transport, horses for supply, horses for artillery. Germany started World War II with 14,000 horses. By February 1945, they had $198,000 because horses died by the thousands and had to be replaced. Each German artillery piece required 6 to 8 horses. Limbering, moving, and unlimbering took hours. In winter conditions, movement became nearly impossible. Gefreiter Paul Richter was assigned to a German artillery battery in Normandy. His diary survived the war, passed through 3 generations of his family before being donated to a military archive. One entry captures the futility perfectly. We watched American artillery displaced during a battle. They fired their mission. Then trucks appeared. Within 20 minutes, the entire battery had limbered their guns and departed. We required 2 hours minimum to perform the same evolution, and that assumed good weather and roads. In mud or under fire, we might need 4 hours. The next paragraph is underlined. The Americans would set up at a new position and be ready to fire again. Before we had finished moving, we were fighting a 19th century war with horses against an enemy, fighting a 20th century war with trucks, though, final line, the outcome was inevitable. American 155-meter howitzers provided even more devastating fire support. Each division had 12 M1 150-meter howitzers in a separate battalion. These guns, firing 43-kilogram shells to ranges exceeding 14,000 meters, provided the division commander with a heavy punch capable of destroying fortifications that would laugh off smaller caliber fire. The 155-meter was itself a triumph of engineering. Designed in the late 1930s, standardized in May 1941. Range, accuracy, and reliability combined in a single package. 300 were produced during the war. The gun could be towed at highway speeds. Rate of fire was 4 rounds per minute, though well-trained crews could briefly achieve 6 rounds per minute. But even these divisional assets paled beside the artillery available at Corps and Army. Level American Corps artillery typically included battalions of 155-meter guns, 8-inch howitzers, and even massive 240-inch howitzers, weapons capable of destroying any fortification ever built. And they could be called upon by forward observers at battalion level. The pyramiding of firepower meant a single rifle company could, within minutes, bring down fire from divisional, corps, and even Army artillery, hundreds of guns, thousands of shells, all focused on a single map grid square. German artillery, by contrast, was rigidly organized. Corps and Army artillery were separate commands, not available to support divisional operations without extensive coordination and approval through multiple headquarters. German infantry divisions had their own artillery, but calling fire from Corps artillery required routing requests through division to Corps, often taking hours for approval. By the time fire arrived, if it arrived at all, American mobile warfare had moved the front line. The target was gone. The opportunity lost. Lieutenant Joachim Weber, a forward observer who requested Corps artillery support during the Normandy campaign, documented his frustration in a letter to his wife that was intercepted by American intelligence. I called for Corps artillery at 1 in 915 hours. The enemy was massing tanks for an assault on our position. I provided exact coordinates, described the target, explained the tactical situation. At 13:30 hours, 4 hours later, I finally received fire. 3 salvos. By that time, the American tanks had completed their attack and withdrawn. Our position was overrun. I survived only by luck. The letter ends. The Corps' artillery, which might have saved us, arrived too late to matter. The technical sophistication of American artillery extended to the ammunition itself, while Germany struggled with propellant shortages and inconsistent shell production. American industry delivered ammunition in seemingly unlimited quantities, manufactured to precise specifications that ensured consistent performance, but more significantly, and this changed everything, the Americans deployed the variable time fuse, the VT fuse, a technological marvel that would prove decisive. The VT fuse, also called the proximity fuse, contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver in the nose of the artillery shell. Think about that for a moment. In 1944, they put a working radar set small enough to fit in a shell, tough enough to survive being fired from a gun, precise enough to detonate at exactly the right altitude. The transmitter broadcast a radio signal. When the shell approached the ground, or any object, the reflected signal triggered detonation. The result was a shell that exploded at optimal height for maximum lethality, typically 10 to 20 meters above the ground. The VT fuse transformed artillery. Effectiveness. Conventional time fuses required calculating the precise time to target, then manually setting the fuse accordingly. Wind affected shell flight. Temperature. Barrel wear. Even small errors meant shells exploding too high or burying themselves in the ground before detonation. The VT fuse eliminated these variables. It guaranteed optimal airburst regardless of conditions every single time. The VT fuse had first been used in combat by the USS Helena on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal with only 2 to 3 salvos. Throughout 1943 and 1944, VT fuses proved devastatingly effective in naval anti-aircraft operations and against V-1 flying bombs over England. But concerns about the technology falling into German hands prevented its use in ground artillery over Europe. The Pentagon was terrified that one unexploded VT-fused shell would give Germany the secret. General Dwight Eisenhower personally requested permission to employ VT fuses during the Battle of the Bulge. He argued that their effectiveness justified the security risk. The Pentagon refused. Eisenhower protested vehemently, with the kind of language that doesn't appear in official cables but everyone remembers. Formal authorization finally came on December 19th through 21st, 1944, shortly after the German offensive began. This marked the first use of VT fuses against ground troops in the European theater. The decision proved correct. VT fused shells devastated German formations caught in the open during the Ardennes. Offensive naval anti-aircraft tests had shown VT fuses were 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional fuses. Against V-1 flying bombs, VT fuses destroyed 79% of all incoming targets. The lethal fragment area was 3,000 square feet versus 60 square feet for conventional fuses. Some estimates suggested VT fuses increased artillery effectiveness by 200 to 700%. Troops who had learned to survive conventional artillery by seeking any depression in the ground, any ditch, any crater, any fold in the terrain, discovered that VT fuses negated such cover. The shells exploded above them, showering downward with deadly fragments that struck men prone in shallow holes. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and there was no time to dig deep bunkers. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller, whose diary opened this account, survived a VT fuse barrage. His entry from December 22, 1944. We had learned on the Eastern Front to go flat at the first explosion. Even shallow depressions offered protection from fragments traveling horizontally. But these shells, these demon shells as we call them, exploded above us. The fragments came down like rain. Men in foxholes, men who should have been protected, killed by fragments that fell vertically. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and we had no time to dig deep bunkers. The handwriting becomes shaky. We simply died. The psychological impact of VT fuses compounded their physical effects. German soldiers trained to respond to artillery by seeking cover found their training irrelevant. They knowledge that no cover short of overhead protection would save them induced paralysis. Some units refused to leave defensive positions, even under direct orders, because movement in the open meant certain death if American artillery engaged them. Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer documented a near mutiny in his unit during the final weeks of the Ardennes offensive. My company was ordered to attack an American position 300 meters distant. The men refused. They had seen what American artillery did to troops in the open, especially with these new fuses that burst in air. I tried to explain that we would die anyway if we did not attack, that the Americans would eventually overrun our position. The next line is written in capital letters. The men would not move. They preferred the possibility of capture to the certainty of death under American artillery fire. American 155mm howitzers provided even more devastating fire support. Each division had 12 M1 155mm howitzers in a separate battalion. These guns, firing 43-kilogram shells to ranges exceeding 14,000 meters, provided the division commander with a heavy punch capable of destroying fortifications that would laugh off smaller caliber fire. The 155mm was itself a triumph of engineering. Designed in the late 1930s, standardized in May 1941. Range, accuracy, and reliability combined in a single package. The 300 were produced during the war. The gun could be towed at highway speeds. Rate of fire was 4 rounds per minute, though well-trained crews could briefly achieve 6 rounds per minute. But even these divisional assets paled beside the artillery available at Corps and Army level. American Corps artillery typically included battalions of 150mm guns, 8-inch howitzers, and even massive 240mm howitzers. Weapons capable of destroying any fortification ever built, and they could be called upon by forward observers at battalion level. The pyramiding of firepower meant a single rifle company could, within minutes, bring down fire from divisional, corps, and even army artillery. Hundreds of guns, thousands of shells, all focused on a single map grid square. German artillery, by contrast, was rigidly organized. Corps and army artillery were separate commands, not available to support divisional operations without extensive coordination and approval through multiple headquarters. German infantry divisions had their own artillery, but calling fire from Corps' artillery required routing requests through division to Corps, often taking hours for approval. By the time fire arrived, if it arrived at all, American mobile warfare had moved the front line. The target was gone, the opportunity lost. Lieutenant Joachim Weber, a forward observer who requested Corps' artillery support during the Normandy campaign, documented his frustration in a letter to his wife that was intercepted by American intelligence. I called for Corps artillery at 0915 hours. The enemy was massing tanks for an assault on our position. I provided exact coordinates, described the target, explained the tactical situation. At 1330 hours, 4 hours later, I finally received fire. 3 salvos. By that time, the American tanks had completed their attack and withdrawn. Our position was overrun. I survived only by luck. The letter ends. The Corps artillery, which might have saved us, arrived too late to matter. The technical sophistication of American artillery extended to the ammunition itself. While Germany struggled with propellant shortages and inconsistent shell production, American industry delivered ammunition in seemingly unlimited quantities, manufactured to precise specifications that ensured consistent performance. But more significantly, and this changed everything, the Americans deployed the variable time fuse, the VT fuse, a technological marvel that would prove decisive. The VT fuse, also called the proximity fuse, contained a miniature radar transmitter and receiver in the nose of the artillery shell. Think about that for a moment. In 1944, they put a working radar set small enough to fit in a shell, tough enough to survive being fired from a gun, precise enough to detonate at exactly the right altitude. The transmitter broadcast a radio signal. When the shell approached the ground, or any object, the reflected signal triggered detonation. The result was a shell that exploded at optimal height for maximum lethality, typically 10 to 20 meters above the ground. The VT fuse transformed artillery effectiveness. Conventional time fuses required calculating the precise time to target, then manually setting the fuse accordingly. Wind affected shell flight, temperature, barrel wear. Even small errors meant shells exploding too high or burying themselves in the ground before detonation. The VT fuse eliminated these variables. It guaranteed optimal airburst regardless of conditions, every single time. The VT fuse had first been used in combat by the USS Helena on January 5, 1943, shooting down a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal with only 2 to 3 salvos. Throughout 1943 and 1944, VT fuses proved devastatingly effective in naval anti-aircraft operations and against V-1 flying bombs over England. But concerns about the technology falling into German hands prevented its use in ground artillery over Europe. The Pentagon was terrified that one unexploded VT-fused shell would give Germany the secret. General Dwight Eisenhower personally requested permission to employ VT fuses during the Battle of the Bulge. He argued that their effectiveness justified the security risk. The Pentagon refused. Eisenhower protested vehemently, with the kind of language that doesn't appear in official cables but everyone remembers. Formal authorization finally came on December 19 through 21, 1944, shortly after the German offensive began. This marked the first use of VT fuses against ground troops in the European theater. The decision proved correct. VT-fused shells devastated German formations caught in the open during the Ardennes offensive. Naval anti-aircraft tests had shown VT fuses were 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional fuses. Against V-1 flying bombs, VT fuses destroyed 79% of all incoming targets. The lethal fragment area was 3,000 square feet versus 60 square feet for conventional fuses. Some estimates suggested VT fuses increased artillery effectiveness by 200 to 700%. Troops who had learned to survive conventional artillery by seeking any depression in the ground, any ditch, any crater, any fold in the terrain, discovered that VT fuses negated such cover. The shells exploded above them, showering downward with deadly fragments that struck men prone in shallow holes. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and there was no time to dig deep bunkers. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller, whose diary opened this account, survived a VT fuse barrage. His entry from December 22, 1944. We had learned on the Eastern Front to go flat at the first explosion. Even shallow depressions offered protection from fragments traveling horizontally. But these shells, these demon shells as we call them, exploded above us. The fragments came down like rain. Men in foxholes, men who should have been protected, killed by fragments that fell vertically. There was no defense except deep bunkers, and we had no time to dig deep bunkers. The handwriting becomes shaky. We simply died. The psychological impact of VT fuses compounded their physical effects. German soldiers, trained to respond to artillery by seeking cover, found their training irrelevant. The knowledge that no cover short of overhead protection would save them induced paralysis. Some units refused to leave defensive positions, even under direct orders, because movement in the open meant certain death if American artillery engaged them. Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer documented a near mutiny in his unit during the final weeks of the Ardennes offensive. "My company was ordered to attack an American position 300 meters distant. The men refused. They had seen what American artillery did to troops in the open, especially with these new fuses that burst in air. I tried to explain that we would die anyway if we did not attack, that the Americans would eventually overrun our position." The industrial capacity that produced American artillery and ammunition in such quantities represented another dimension of superiority that German soldiers could not comprehend. Rock Island Arsenal alone produced over 10,105mm howitzers. Multiple factories produced 155mm howitzers and heavier weapons. Shell production reached staggering levels throughout the war. German production, hampered by Allied bombing, resource shortages, and inefficient allocation of industrial capacity, never approached American levels. German artillery pieces were often superior in design to their American counterparts. The German 105mm LEFH-18 was arguably a better gun than the M2A1. But Germany produced them in insufficient numbers and lacked the industrial capacity to maintain production as the war continued. By 1944, German artillery batteries often operated at half strength, guns destroyed or worn out, no replacements available. More critically, German ammunition production could not sustain intensive operations. German artillery batteries were often limited to minimal daily allowances, sometimes as few as 2 to 3 shells per gun per day. Think about that. 2 shells per day. American batteries faced no such restrictions. Forward observers could call for fire freely, knowing that ammunition supply was effectively unlimited. Lieutenant Werner Vogel, a German artillery officer, documented the ammunition crisis in his war diary with the careful notation of a man watching his world collapse. "We received 50 shells per gun for the entire week. 50 shells to support an infantry regiment facing continuous American attacks. I was required to justify each fire mission to battalion, explaining why this particular target merited expenditure of irreplaceable ammunition. Meanwhile, American artillery fired thousands of shells daily with no apparent concern for conservation." The final line: "We fought a poor man's war against a rich man's enemy." The disparity in ammunition supply manifested in tactical doctrine. German artillery doctrine emphasized mass fire on high-value targets, delivered only after careful planning and approval. American doctrine emphasized responsive fire, immediately available to support infantry operations. An American infantry platoon leader could request and receive artillery support within minutes. A German platoon leader might wait hours for fire, if he received any at all. The logistics of ammunition supply further highlighted American advantages. American artillery was fully motorized, supplied by truck convoys that could deliver thousands of shells to forward positions within hours. German artillery, horse-drawn, and often dependent on rail transport for long-distance movement, struggled to maintain adequate forward stocks. As Allied air power interdicted German rail networks, ammunition supply became increasingly difficult, then increasingly desperate, then increasingly impossible. American logistics also benefited from standardization. The M1 shell fired by 105mm howitzers used the same fuse as shells fired by 155mm howitzers and larger calibers. This standardization simplified supply, reduced inventory requirements, ensured that fuses were always available. German ammunition production, plagued by multiple fuse designs and caliber variants, suffered chronic shortages of specific components even when overall production remained adequate. You might have shells but no fuses, or fuses but no shells of the right caliber, or both, but no way to get them to the front. It was death by 1,000 logistical cuts. The superiority of American artillery created a cascading effect on German tactical options. German commanders, knowing that massing forces would draw devastating artillery fire, dispersed their units. But dispersed units lacked combat power, could be defeated piecemeal. Concentrated forces could generate combat power, but became targets for American artillery. Either choice led to defeat. You couldn't win. You could only choose how you wanted to lose. The Ardennes Offensive, Germany's final major attack in the West, demonstrated these dynamics with brutal clarity. German planning depended on fog and overcast weather to neutralize American air power. The planners correctly assessed that American aircraft could not operate in bad weather. What they failed to understand was that American artillery didn't require good weather. Artillery doesn't care about clouds. During the opening days of the offensive, German armored and infantry divisions achieved significant penetrations against surprised American forces. Over 200,000 German troops and approximately 1,000 tanks launched the initial assault on December 16, 1944. For the first 2 days, it looked like it might work. Then American artillery found them, and the killing began. Lacking the mobility to rapidly displace when taken under fire, German horse-drawn artillery batteries were destroyed in place. Lacking the ammunition reserves to engage in sustained counter-battery fire, German guns fell silent while American guns continued to fire. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, whose diary provides extensive detail on German artillery operations during the Bulge, recorded the disparity with the precision of a man documenting his own death sentence. Our battery was located in woods south of Sankt Vith. We had 50 shells per gun, our entire allocation for the operation. We fired a mission in support of our infantry. Within 10 minutes, American counter-battery fire destroyed 3 of our 6 guns and killed most of the horses. We attempted to displace the remaining guns but lacked horses to move them. We abandoned the guns and withdrew on foot. The next paragraph. This was the pattern across the entire front. Our artillery was silenced while American artillery continued to fire without pause. At Bastogne, the surrounded American-held town that became the symbol of the battle, American artillery ammunition was actually restricted to only 10 rounds per gun per day on December 22nd due to shortages. Despite this constraint, American artillery proved decisive in breaking German attacks around the surrounded town. When the weather cleared after Christmas, supply resumed, and American artillery fire intensified dramatically. During the entire Bulge campaign, 4,155 American guns fired 1,255,000 artillery rounds, 1,255,000 shells. Think about that number. Try to imagine it. German units that had penetrated 50 kilometers into American lines found themselves trapped, surrounded by American forces that could call upon unlimited artillery support once resupply resumed. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller, whose regiment had been destroyed at St. Lo 6 months earlier, commanded a replacement regiment during the Bulge. His final report was written in a prisoner of war camp after his capture in January 1945. It provides a stark assessment that reads like an epitaph for the Wehrmacht. We were defeated by American artillery before we were defeated by American infantry or armor. Every movement we made was observed by their aircraft and engaged by their artillery. Every concentration of forces was broken up by artillery fire before we could attack. Every defensive position was smashed by artillery before their infantry assaulted. We could not move, could not mass, could not defend. We simply absorbed artillery fire until we ceased to exist as an effective force. The offensive, planned to drive through to Antwerp and split Allied armies, stalled after less than a week, broken primarily by American artillery. Units that began the offensive at full strength ended it with 30 to 40% casualties. Artillery fire accounted for the majority of losses. The lessons learned. by German soldiers who survived American artillery came too late to change the war's outcome. Those captured and sent to prisoner of war camps in the United States discovered that the artillery system that had destroyed their units represented just one aspect of American military capability. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, captured in Tunisia, held at a camp in Texas, wrote in a letter that passed American censors. The tone is almost confessional. I have seen American industry. I have watched trains carrying artillery pieces, hundreds of them, moving toward ports for shipment overseas. I have seen factories producing shells by the thousands. The Americans defeated us not through superior tactics or superior soldiers, though their tactics were good and their soldiers brave. They defeated us through sheer industrial might. They could afford to fire 100 shells where we fired one. They could afford to lose equipment and replace it within days. The final line, we could not match this, could never match this, no matter how long we fought. German prisoners of war who witnessed American artillery training exercises in the United States saw firsthand the professionalism and preparation that made the system so effective. American artillery crews trained constantly, practicing the coordination and communication that allowed time-on-target missions. Forward observers worked closely with infantry units, practicing the integration that made American combined arms operations so effective. It wasn't magic. It was rehearsal, practice, repetition until coordination became instinct. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, the artillery officer captured in Italy, attended lectures at a prisoner of war camp where American artillery officers explained their methods. His notes, preserved in German archives, reveal professional admiration bordering on awe. They have systematized everything we did by individual skill and initiative. Where we depended on talented artillery officers computing firing solutions through experience and calculation, they created tables that allow average officers to achieve the same results. Where we depended on good radio operators maintaining communication under difficult conditions, they produced radios so reliable that even minimally trained operators could maintain contact. They have taken the art of artillery and transformed it into an industrial process, repeatable and scalable. The last line is underlined. This is the secret of their success. The transformation of German prisoners extended beyond technical appreciation. Many realized that German propaganda about American military weakness had been completely false. The Americans they encountered, both as enemies on the battlefield and as captors in prison camps, demonstrated professional competence, industrial capability, and organizational skill that exceeded German capabilities in nearly every dimension. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller, whose diary chronicled his experiences in the Ardennes, was captured during the collapse of the German offensive. His later diary entries, written in a prisoner of war camp, reflect a complete reversal of his earlier beliefs. We were told the Americans were inferior soldiers, that they lacked fighting spirit, that they depended on material superiority because they lacked the skill and courage of German soldiers. These were lies. American soldiers fought with courage and skill, but they also fought with overwhelming material advantages that German courage and skill could not overcome. Most significantly, they fought with an artillery system so advanced that we had no effective counter. The final sentence, this, more than any other factor, defeated us. By early 1945, as Germany's situation became hopeless, American artillery superiority only increased. German ammunition production collapsed under Allied bombing. German artillery units lost experienced crews to casualties, received inadequate replacements. German horses, essential for moving artillery, died by the thousands, from overwork, from lack of fodder, from American fire. German batteries that had operated with 6 guns at the war's beginning now operated with 2 or 3. Some divisions had no functional artillery at all. American artillery, by contrast, grew stronger. Production continued to accelerate even as the war in Europe approached its end. American factories produced more artillery pieces in 1944 than in any previous year. Ammunition production reached levels that allowed American forces to fire without restriction. New technologies, improved fire direction computers, better radios, enhanced effectiveness. Further, the gap between American and German artillery capability didn't narrow, it widened. The end came in May 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. In the final battles, American artillery demonstrated capabilities that would have seemed impossible. Just years earlier, single battalions could deliver overwhelming firepower on demand. Multiple corps artillery could coordinate fire on area targets, saturating entire map grid squares with shells. Forward observers could call down destruction on any target within minutes, confident that accurate fire would arrive quickly. German survivors of these final battles carried with them profound respect for American artillery. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, the mathematics professor who had analyzed American firing tables, was captured in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945. His final military report, written for American intelligence officers, provides professional analysis of American artillery effectiveness. The American artillery system represents the culmination of industrial-age warfare. They have applied industrial methods, mass production, standardization, systematic training, to create a weapon system of unprecedented effectiveness. Individual German artillery pieces may be superior in design. Individual German artillery officers may match American skill. But the Americans have created a system that does not depend on individual superiority. Their system produces consistent, overwhelming, rapidly delivered firepower regardless of individual skill levels. This systematization represents a revolution in warfare that Germany never matched, and could not match given our industrial limitations. In the decades after the war, historians analyzing American military effectiveness in World War II identified artillery as perhaps the single most important advantage American forces possessed. While tanks and aircraft received public attention, it was artillery that broke German attacks, supported American advances, and inflicted the majority of casualties in the Western theater. German military professionals studying their defeat after the war consistently identified American artillery superiority as a decisive factor. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his post-war analysis, "American artillery achieved what we believed impossible. They transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a dominant weapon system. Their coordination, their fire control, their logistics, their industrial production created an artillery force that could not be matched or countered." German forces in the West operated under constant artillery threat, unable to mass without drawing devastating fire, unable to move without observation, unable to fight effectively under the weight of American shells. The tactical innovations developed by American artillery during World War II became the foundation for modern artillery doctrine. Time on target remains the standard method for coordinating artillery fires. Fire direction centers remain the hub of artillery operations. Forward observers closely integrated with maneuver forces remain essential for delivering responsive fire support. The basic structure established by the United States in World War II persists to this day. The proximity fuse represented such a significant advance that its full impact remained classified for years. After the war, when the technology was finally declassified, military analysts called it one of the three most important technological developments of World War II, alongside the atomic bomb and radar. For the German soldiers who faced VT-fused shells, the psychological impact combined with the physical casualties often broke unit cohesion entirely. German soldiers caught in the open by VT-fused shells had no effective defense. No technique learned on the Eastern Front worked. No training could prepare them. No amount of courage could save them. You just died. For the German soldiers who faced American artillery, the experience left permanent impressions. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who survived multiple, taught barrages during the Bulge, immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. In a 1960 interview, decades after the war, he reflected on his experiences. The interviewer asked what weapon he feared most during the war. Zimmermann paused for a long time before answering. Not tanks, though German tanks were inferior to late-war American tanks. Not aircraft, though American air power was overwhelming. Not even American infantry, though they fought well. Another pause. Longer. The weapon I feared most, the weapon that gave me nightmares then, and sometimes still does today, was American artillery. The sudden, devastating fire that arrived without warning. The knowledge that you might die without ever seeing your enemy, killed by shells fired from guns kilometers away. His voice drops. This was true. Terror. The story of German soldiers and American artillery is ultimately a story about the transformation of warfare in the industrial age. Individual courage and tactical skill remained important, but they were overshadowed by industrial production, systematic training, and organizational efficiency. The Americans had created a system that amplified the capabilities of average soldiers, making them more effective than exceptional German soldiers fighting with inferior systems and inadequate support. It wasn't fair. War never is. But it was decisive. The artillery that broke German forces in World War II was not the product of a single innovation or a brilliant individual. It was the product of systematic analysis, industrial application, comprehensive training, abundant resources. It represented American military power at its most effective, using industrial capacity and organizational skill to create overwhelming combat, power rooms full of women with mechanical calculators, engineers designing better radios, factory workers producing shells by the thousands, trainers drilling gun crews until coordination became instinct, logistics officers ensuring ammunition reached the front, all of it working together as a single, integrated system, a system greater than the sum of its parts. For the German soldiers who faced this system, the experience was transformative. They entered the war believing in German superiority, technical excellence, superior training, battlefield experience forged in blood across Europe and Russia. They ended the war, understanding that American industrial might and organizational capability had surpassed German capabilities, not through individual brilliance, not through tactical genius, through systematic application of resources and relentless focus on efficiency. They had learned to fear American artillery above all other weapons because it represented the unbridgeable gap between German methods and American power. The fog hung thick over the Ardennes forest that morning. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller sat in his foxhole, writing in his diary. Around him, the forest was quiet. He didn't know that within hours, American artillery would find his position. He didn't know that his battalion would cease to exist as an effective fighting force by nightfall. He didn't know that he would survive, say, one of the lucky few, and spend the rest of his life trying to explain what it felt like to face the most lethal artillery system ever deployed in warfare. But in that moment, in the frozen quiet before the storm, he understood something fundamental had changed. The Americans are not like the Russians. He finished writing, closed the diary, tucked it inside his coat. Above him, somewhere in the fog, he heard the distant drone of an aircraft, a grasshopper, and Hans Müller knew he had maybe 3 minutes left before the world exploded. The sound of that little engine faded into the mist, and then came the silence. That terrible, pregnant silence before artillery fire. The moment when soldiers held their breath and waited for what they knew was coming. Because once you'd heard American artillery, once you'd survived it even once, you recognized that silence for what it was. Not an absence of sound, but the presence of something inevitable. Somewhere miles away, American gun crews were already loading shells. Fire direction centers were calculating trajectories. Forward observers were adjusting coordinates. The entire system, that massive, integrated industrial-age killing machine, was winding up like clockwork, perfect, efficient, unstoppable, and all of it focused on one grid square in the Ardennes, forest, where German soldiers waited in frozen foxholes, writing letters they'd never send, thinking thoughts they'd never finish, living the last moments of lives that were already over. 3 minutes, that's all the warning they had. In the history of warfare, 3 minutes is nothing. Not enough time to run, not enough time to dig deeper, not enough time to pray, just enough time to understand that you're about to die, and that there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. The shells arrived exactly on time. Dozens of them, from batteries miles apart, all coordinated to land within the same 3-second window, time on target. The last thing Hans Müller wrote in his diary was a single sentence, found by American soldiers, weeks later when they overran the position. God, forgive us for starting this war, because in the end, that's what American artillery taught every German soldier who survived it. That they had picked a fight with an enemy whose industrial capacity and organizational capability they could never match, an enemy that could produce shells faster than Germany could produce soldiers, enemy that could coordinate fire with mathematical precision while German batteries still relied on individual skill and luck, an enemy that had transformed artillery from an art into a science, from a weapon into a system, from a supporting arm into the dominant force on the battlefield. The guns fell silent eventually. They always do, but their echoes still whisper through the forests of the Ardennes in the diaries of German soldiers who survived, in the reports of commanders who watched their units destroyed from miles away, in the memories of men who learned too late what it meant to face American artillery, and in the unmarked graves of thousands who never learned at all because they died in the first 3 seconds of the barrage, before they could even understand what was happening, before they could react, before they could do anything except cease to exist. That morning in December 1944, the fog finally lifted, revealing a forest transformed into a graveyard, where German soldiers had learned the final, terrible lesson of World War II, that courage and skill mean nothing against shells that arrive without warning, that individual excellence cannot defeat systematic efficiency, that in industrial warfare, the nation with the factories wins, and American artillery was the proof. Written in steel and fire and blood, across every battlefield, where German and American forces met, a message the Wehrmacht received loud and clear, but far, far too late.